Now, our next speaker comes from a city that has also hosted the Olympics, Melbourne, in 1956. But I don't think that he will speak a lot about, there you are, he will not speak a lot about sports and the Olympic Games. Rob Adams will tell us how Melbourne has become one of the most livable cities in the world, according at least to The Economist. Rob is an architect and urban designer, director of city design in Melbourne. He is often given much of the credit for transforming Melbourne into an innovative, dynamic, and vibrant community, famous throughout the world. Melbourne is growing, just like Copenhagen, for example, as you can read about in the report. And Rob will tell us how we might be able to grow with charm. So please welcome Rob Adams from Melbourne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity, and to Realdania for the very kind invitation to come and talk. This talk is in 25, so I'm going to talk about the last 25 years, I'm going to talk about the next 25 years, and I'm going to do it in 25 minutes. So this is about doing more with less, from 25 years ago into the future, and I think that's what I see sustainability as. We had to change our city in the 1980s. We had to change it into a multifunctional city. Why? Because it was dying, and newspapers used to write about it like this. We looked at the city, and what we found is many of the problems you find in a lot of cities. It had started on a river where the port was. It had grown up, and the port was connected to the city. But over time, what was a port became a car park, and we built bridges between the city and the river. And what we had to do was take the structures that were there and not pull them down, but re-transform them through light and sculpture to become positive, to reinvent the river and connect it back to the city and put buildings underneath, and slowly take an area that had been derelict and reconnect it back to its city, pulling down freeways and re-inhabiting those sites, so again the fabric of the city joined to its river. And that took us 25 years. We had to look then at the nature of our city, the place that we had built up, how it had been formed, its own character, understand the public spaces were not only the normal public spaces, the big roads, and we didn't have too many squares, but how our city had been developed, how the big blocks had led to a subdivision, and this had led to lanes and arcades that people walked through, and how that was being changed in the 1960s with the consolidation of land. And architects like I.M. Pei, who came to our city and built the slide in the middle that turned streets into concrete walls. And to make the decision that we didn't want to go there and therefore not allow anybody else to build buildings that made our streets into alien spaces. And we brought up sites and showed how you could take a big site in the center of Melbourne and build in the same character of the old city, but with a modern development. And even the competitions we ran had to be of our city. This has the lanes and arcades that come through. It's a new square built over the railway lines and won by an international competition. We took small spaces and built places for people to sit. Restaurants, we cut a hole in the town hall, and we put a flower seller on the corner who sold until 10:30 at night at a very low rental. So he became our passive policeman, our information, our eyes on the street. And we took traffic islands and turned them into places where people could sit and we could celebrate the communities that make us up. We took spaces that were failing, like our city square, that was designed and won many architecture competitions, but people didn't sit in it. And we sold half the site, we reinvested in the theatre next door, made the site smaller, and made it into a place where people could sit and enjoy our city. And we increased our public spaces. This is 1983 when we started our strategy, and 1985 is when we started, and this is 2004. We started to add public space back to our city. We had to bring back a population into our city. We didn't have people living in the city. So we took old buildings and we did it on the back of a recession in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We worked with banks that had buildings in receivership. This was subdivided into 36 units and sold off the plan. Old buildings like this started to be converted to residential. Buildings like this that used to be for the telcos became residential, and you can see were added onto. So an overlayering, not a knocking down, but a accretion to our city. And this is what's happened. 1983, each of those red dots is 5 dwellings. 1992, 97, 2002. We fundamentally changed the center of our city, and we made it a place where people live, bars, cafes, restaurants, and now you can get traffic jams at 11:30 on a Saturday evening rather than 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. But we made it the place that it was what wanted to be. It had to be Melbourne. It didn't have to be any other city. So we took paving that was from the city, and where we hadn't had paving, we made it compulsory to use only one paving, as you do in Copenhagen. And we made sure that that whole area became an area that was paved with the bluestone. It gave us a good walking city, a good walking surface, to which we added cafes, restaurants, public art in art programs, temporary art that came into our city in our laneways and was installed only for 2 or 3 months, but gave people a place to discover and use our laneways. And we celebrated street art. We've become one of the capitals of street art in the world, and people come to see our street art. We designed our own furniture that will last for 50 years, not furniture that will get damaged and not wear the test of time. Toilets, information systems, many of them paid by private enterprise, with telcos having their installations on top of the information systems. And we planted trees. We found every place in the center of the city that we could plant trees, and we planted trees to, in fact, improve the climate of our city and the amenity of it. And then the secret, coffee. In 1985, when I was writing the strategy, people didn't sit out on the streets. And what we started to do was celebrate our streets, places where you could have coffee, buy fruit, flowers. This is how many coffee bars we had in 1983. 1993, 2004, and now we've got something like 600 cafes and bars and restaurants on our footpaths. What we did is we started to steal back the road for people. So because the automobile is so predominant in our city, we started to take little pieces. We widened the footpaths, we planted trees down the middle of the streets, we took parking off one side of the street and widened the footpaths so people could shop and walk in elegance. And we started to allow people to externalize their businesses onto the streets and onto the lanes and made them attractive places. We started to build a bicycle network. Our ambition is to have more bicycles on the road than Copenhagen. At the moment, you can see our facilities are very poor in comparison to Copenhagen. But we've increased our bicycles from 1% commuters in 2002 to 10% in 2011. And we're looking at trying to increase that every year and improve the facilities. We closed the main street through the center of the city to motor cars. Used to have 20,000 motor cars. We widened the footpaths, planted 100 trees. And we increased the pedestrian numbers by double in 10 years. You now have 65,000 people walking down that street, and it's got a 2% vacancy rate in the retail. It is one of the most successful streets in Melbourne. And while I'm here today, we're changing that street yet again with new tram stops that allow you to get onto the trams with disabled access, and with much greater elegance than we've done in the past. Our parks and gardens, we are lucky. We've got a fantastic ring of parks that go around our city, but we've tried to improve them. We've tried to take this park that runs around the edge of our city, that used to be divided, as you can see there, by 56 railway lines. And when we built Federation Square, that, if I point to it, is that building that was knocked down in front of the cathedral, is where Federation Square went. We also took, with the state government, the railway lines down to 12, and we built the dream we had had in 1986. This was the park in 1986. We wanted to make it into a single park, and we were lucky enough to, in fact, move the railway lines and build 8 hectares of parkland, which we designed and delivered next to the river. And what we did is we measured our successes. We worked with a very intelligent person, Jan Gell, who came to our city and helped us measure how we had changed it. was an external voice who told people how good it was to have people in their city and helped us to achieve sensational change in our city. And it is something that we've done as we go along. Each 10 years, we measure how we've changed. And what that means is the newspapers now write good things about our city. One of the most important things, and the things I think is relevant to us, this is cheaper. By putting all those people close to the city, our taxes have gone down by half. Not that we're taking less money, but we're charging the same amount of money against a greater population. This is a very cheap way. We built very few roads, very few infrastructure. We're using the infrastructure we've got far more intelligently. In the year 2000, we decided we had to go to sustainability, zero emissions by 2020, reducing our water. We set a target, and we started to work towards that to make our buildings more efficient. We put solar voltaics on our market, our historic market, to collect energy. Every building we build now is a very high efficiency in energy. This uses a third of the energy of normal libraries. This is a little library we designed. It uses geothermal to help heat and cool it. This bowling club uses the surface underneath the bowling green and natural ventilation to cool it. So we run the wires underneath, the water underneath the bowling green, as you can see here. Very simple systems to help cool the bowling club. And even this, which is an adventure playground, we work with the children to understand green roofs and how you grow vegetables, etc. Painting roofs, a simple way of keeping buildings cooler, is something we've started doing as well. We also built the first 6-star environmental building in Australia, a commercial office building. Our government had enough sense to allow us to build this, $51 million. It's our administrative office. One of its best technologies is it uses the local environment. That yellow streak through the middle is the temperature of the building, and this is our hottest month, January and February. And you can see we have cool evenings and hot days. So the most sophisticated piece of technology in this building is that we can open the windows. We open the windows at night and we cool the building down, and it saves us 20% of our energy. With the other technology, all the environmental features of this building have been paid off in 6 years. $11 million. And most of that was because of the improved productivity and well-being of the people in the building. The energy came to $370,000 a year saving. The environment, the indoor environment of the building was saving us $2.4 million a year in improved conditions for our staff in that building. So this is a good investment. We're now looking at how we convert all our existing buildings, and we're running a program where we've got new finance systems where we can borrow against the rates, and we've got legislation to do that. And we've got 36 buildings who are starting to retrofit themselves with low interest money, and we've got 110 buildings looking at the prospect of doing this. We've got a problem with our parks and gardens because we're in a very dry climate, and we've had to survey our trees. We're going to lose 48% of our trees in the next 20 years. This is a shocking realization that has come after 11 years of what some people call drought, but is the start of climate change. You can see our trees were old, and you can see down the middle the period of drought, that very long period of drought, which is very unusual for us. The drop in the amount of rainfall we're getting in our city. So most of our projects now are how do we capture water directly into the trees as we plant them? How do we take it off the road? We're digging up roads and putting water tanks under the roads to collect water in many of these areas. We're collecting water that runs off from the suburbs and purifying it, and these are some of the water projects. Now, what about the next 25 years? If we look back to go forward, we overreacted to the Industrial Revolution. We believed Ebenezer hard that we could work in the city and live in the country. We produced suburbia, and this is the stuff we built. And this is how we spend most of our time, and this is starting to kill us, literally from a health point of view, and I'll go there. This is an intersection in Melbourne. No city has ever solved the problem of motor cars by building more roads. So what are the trends in our cities? Griffith University has done this. This measures the vulnerability of our population to oil and mortgages. You can see from 2001 to 2006, there are more people in Melbourne, many of whom have very good jobs, who are worse off now than they were 5, 6 years ago. So our city is dying. Violence, you can also take to those areas surrounding the city. This is not working. In fact, people are worried about our farmland being bought up by other countries. We've taken 89 million hectares and put it under asphalt and concrete. People used to do it because they thought if you could buy on the fringe, you could have a house moving into the city. So on the left-hand side is the inner city, on the right-hand side is the outer city. $100,000 difference. Not today. The difference is huge. If you buy on the fringe of the city now, your house is worth less when you move into it than the day you bought it. Our population is changing. We're getting older. In fact, the only sector of our population that's going down is mom and dad and 2 kids. All the rest is going up. So what's happening in our city is that more people are now building apartments. If I spoke about apartments 10 years ago, 1 or 2% of the building starts would be apartments. We've just reached 50% this year, 50% apartments, 50% detached. Yet our government is still subdividing land on the fringe. This will not work, and not only will it not work, it's very expensive. 1,000 houses built on the fringe will cost you $300 million more in infrastructure and other costs than 1,000 houses built within the existing infrastructure. So as Melbourne goes from 4 to 5 million over the next 10 years, we will spend $110 billion more than we have to spend by putting half of the development on the fringe. That's equal to 3 national broadband systems. It's a huge amount of money. We don't think about our economy in terms of residential. We think about it as coal and resources. We're a mining country. Yet residential makes up 8% of our GDP. Coal mining makes up 2% of GDP. If we get all that stuff in the wrong place and the wrong type, what does that do to our economy? I want to talk about capacity, and very quickly. We know this slide. We know that half the world's population live in the cities. What we mostly also know now is that in 50 years, 70% is going to live there. We're going to have to double the capacity of our cities. And they're pumping out the greenhouse gases, and they're driving our economies. And we've heard Bruce talk about that. How do we do that and allow people to fit in? I go back to my university in Cape Town. When I left in 1970, I had 5,000 students. When the baby boomers hit that university, most of the universities expanded. This university could not expand because it sat on the side of the mountain surrounded by a national park. What they did is they re-timetabled. They checked to see how they were using their facilities, and they found lecture theatres were being used for 17.5% of the time. So what they did is they trebled their student numbers, they didn't expand the land, and they filled the gaps in their city. And when I went back 30 years later to give a talk like I'm giving today, I thought I would see the campus ruined. But what I found is it had an energy, a vitality. People were there at 8 o'clock in the morning and still there at 12 o'clock at night. So my question is, if that can happen in a university, how do we re-timetable our cities? Where does the capacity go? And we did a study for Melbourne. And we can fit another 4 million people into Melbourne without building any more development on the fringe and by using only 7.5% of the land. And I'll show you very quickly how you do it. Jump up in a helicopter, look at our city. Around our railway stations, you can draw a line. You can fit 860,000 people if you build no higher than 8 stories and 60% of the land area. And you will fit nearly 1 million people around the railway stations. Why is that important? Because we've got a lot of them. They're well connected. If you then, and that's 3% of our metro area, if you then take your road-based public transport, your buses and your trams, and you look at that area, another 3% of the metro area, what I was surprised to find, what a fantastic system we had. The trains aren't there, that is our trams and our buses. This fantastic network, but sometimes those buses only run once a day. So what if you could make that more efficient? What if you could put the buildings close to the transport system? So we took every parcel of land in the city. There are 1.5 million parcels of land in our city. And we looked at all the properties that ran along these public transport routes, but only with a 16-minute headway, so buses or trams coming every 16 minutes. And there were 120,000 sites. You can see this figure down the bottom. We then took out parks. We took out public use and industrial. We took out properties that didn't have rear access, so if we built 6 stories, we didn't have a big black hole going into the building. We took out recently developed sites. We took out heritage listed sites and we took out 50% of the capacity in heritage overlay areas. And we took out the very small sites, less than 6 meter frontage. What we ended up with was 34,000 sites that didn't have any of those sensitivities. And we said, well, what if you put a density on there, a density of 180 people per hectare or 450, and that's just on the site. You could get between 1 million and 2.4 million people living close to public transport on only 3% of the land in the metro area. What does 180 to 450 look like? That's 180 at the top, it's 3 stories. The building down the bottom, by the way, is prefabricated, fully fabricated in the factory and delivered to site, which is dealing with a lot of the affordability issues. This is what 450 looks like, 7 stories. Vienna, the world's most livable city, and forget the Economist study, it's not a good measure of whether cities are succeeding. This, I think, is one of the most livable cities. It's a compact city, gets 900 people on that site. So we said, well, what will that look like? We took sites around the city. You can see our city in the background, expensive infrastructure in the ground here, our tram lines. Look at the fabric next to it. So what if that could look like that? What if this street down here you could reinvent in this way, or this one here in this way? Only the properties facing onto the public transport. And the last 1.5% went to known redevelopment sites, things like our docklands and sites that already have permits. So we could get close to 4 million people on 7.5% of the land. Why is that important? We don't have to touch this. So the political fear of changing suburbia that is in Americas and Australia and places like that, we don't have to touch it. In fact, this is where you can collect water, grow trees, and put photovoltaics on the roof and generate energy. This is the new green lung of our city, and we can work with it, not against it. It's not an either-or. So what's the new paradigm? The new paradigm is transformation. The project I showed you earlier, not knocking down things, but using the things you've got more efficiently. And you saw this slide. When our public transport system came under pressure, what did they do? They made it free before 7 o'clock. 2,600 people went on before 7 o'clock, saved them $100 million, which would have been buying 5 new trains, and they forewent $15 million in fares. They changed the timetable. They didn't build more infrastructure. We know how inefficient the road is. It's not inefficient if you put bicycles or buses on, only if you put cars on. So this is one of our major streets. We carry 1/3 of the people down that street in those buses. There are more people in those buses than all of those cars put together. People said if we put this model in our city, we would get congestion. The data shows that the closer you get to public transport, the fewer cars people are owning. And that is logical. As Danes, being pragmatic, you would understand it. Some of our academics don't. And the humble bus. I've often thought we've overlooked the bus, and I'm going to have to move on very quickly. I think the bus is part of our solution. Digging holes and putting things underground is great, but it's expensive. The bus, we've got the existing infrastructure. Just give it the priority, and it will start to work for you. We know that people who use public transport walk for 41 minutes a day. People who use motor cars walk for 7 minutes a day, and obesity is costing Australia $58 billion. Our suburbs are failing. This is from our newspaper a few weeks ago. So how do we do this? We have a very simple planning scheme that says that's where we want to build, next to the tram lines, and in the other areas we don't want to build, we want to save the character of those areas. We've done it in one street where we carry most of our trams. You can see the buildings adjacent to the street, and then they get lower behind. This is what the planning scheme could look like. 1 page, where you give priority to the way you build. Buildings no higher than the width of the street, entry from the back, and cut-off angles so you don't overshadow the back. Why is this important? Because if we started to build our population around our railway stations and our major public transport routes, we will start to get some jobs going close to the people. What does it look like? It looks a bit like this. And you would get the development coming along those. You don't build on that stuff, and that becomes your new green wedge. So, ending, is this going to happen? Despite the governments, and it seems that much of us we've been talking today is that despite our governments, it is happening because the developers understand the logic of this. So this is a street in Melbourne. You can see the development going in next to the historic building at the same height. This tiny little development here with 4 stories has got a density of 200 people per hectare. You walk down the street, you don't even notice it, it disappears. So the character of the street is retained. It's happening already in our city, all over the city. The trouble we've got is this is what our architects sent to the Venice Biennale last year. This is Australian urbanism. So you wonder, this comes out of our leading academic institution, where I'm a professor, I'm afraid to say. This is living by the water. This is suburbia. This message is not helpful. It frightens the population about what the future will look like. The future will look very familiar. This is what the future looks like, and these are the last 2 slides. That is a piece of my city today. You can see the major city in the background. You can see, and maybe I should just point to it very quickly, you can see the tram coming down the street there. And what will it look like in 20 years' time? It'll look like that. We've got a strategy to double the number of trees, photovoltaics on the roof, collect water, and if we collect all the water that falls on our city, we've got enough water for all our trees and our needs, and you'll get 4 or 5 stories of development along those transportation routes. The future is not frightening. We have to start a dialogue with people and use these techniques to illustrate what the future looks like. Thank you.
Sure. And I think that to this audience, this was a very encouraging message, and actually one that you will also find in the scenario report when we talk about City of Copenhagen and other cities in Denmark. They will probably, in 38 years' time, look very much like today, but they will hopefully be improved in much the way that you talk about here. So just a few questions. You alluded to it a few times, but just very briefly, what is the economy for Melbourne in this transformation? Is it good? It looks like an awful lot of investments, but is there a payback, which is...
I think the payback is coming in many ways. I mean, what Melbourne did 25 years ago is it stopped looking at Sydney and tried to compare itself to Sydney. It looked at itself and said, what can we do well? And it started, building on its own characteristics. To the extent now that we are told that Melbourne will go past Sydney in population in 10 years' time. People have come back to Melbourne to live because it's a good place to live in. And the economy is being driven by some manufacturing, but the old manufacturing, unfortunately not enough of the new manufacturing. But it's also being driven by this heavy demand of the building industry. The need to build a large number of houses in a short period of time. So the economy has been healthy. In the last few months, we've had, 12 months, we've had a new state government come in, and they've pulled back on just about everything. In fact, they're not known to have made many decisions at all. And unfortunately, what's happening is you can see the economy starting to slow.
In Melbourne?
In Melbourne. So I think the challenge for us is to recognize where the new economy is. If we are going to be a sustainable city, and we've been highly successful of programs putting solar voltaics into the city and now collecting water, why aren't we building those economies up? And I think the challenge for us is to recognize we're already in the green economy and start investing in it. And I think that's exactly the message Bruce was giving us. So I'm optimistic for the future because we've got growth and we've got a city that people enjoy living in.
So what do Australians think about not living in houses with gardens and living in high-rise buildings and apartments?
Well, the interesting thing is, if you speak to the real estate fraternity, and if you speak to the big developers, they will tell you that Australians, will only ever want to live in suburbia. But the reality of the figures are that at least half of the people, or the houses that were built, were apartments. So you have people of my age, who the kids have left home, who are now saying, I don't want to go to an old age home. I want to, in fact, live in a community. And they're seeking out community. And so you've got young professionals, older people, and a lot of people who do not want to spend a lot of time driving, starting to come back into the city.
So our preferences are also transforming slowly?
I think they are, and I think we're seeing it from the old and the young. There's still a middle section that most of us still think that suburbia is the answer. But the fact that the big developers are having trouble selling the house and the land package on the fringe, I think is a good indication.
Yeah, of course. So you must get this question all the time when you give your speeches. Are these solutions transferable to other economies, other cultures, other places on the planet?
I think they are. Obviously, I don't advocate that you take solutions from one city and just transport them identically. But I think my small understanding of what's happening in the United States is I think what we've done is instantly transferable.
And Bruce is nodding his head, I can tell you.
I was checking to see if I was okay. In South Africa, where I studied, I would see that transferable. In fact, I went back to Johannesburg, where my wife's parents live, and looked at many of the major streets that run through there, and just imagined in these rich suburbs, if you started to put low-income housing in many of the dirt strips beside that, what that would do for the economy of Johannesburg, rather than just pushing these people further and further out. So I think they are transferable. Maybe not as instantly transferable for cities that are about to be built, new cities, because I think they will build in a completely different model.
Yes.
But for the suburban spread cities, the post-motor car cities, those I think it is transferable.
And typically Australian, I get one of your main points is that what is driving the economy and the transformation is bars, right? Cafes and bars.
That's right. Yeah.
That's
this is
key
very important
to your strategy.
It's key
Places where you can go and have a beer.
It's key to the strategy, but it's something that comes from my heritage because my great-grandmother was from Denmark.
Oh, okay. Point taken. Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Adams.